Okay. Good morning once again. I hope you have enjoyed the discussion yesterday. And let us begin the day with a summary of the day one, which is going to be presented by Dr. Liang Park, the Regional Director of the United Nations Environment Program for the Regional Office for the Asia and the Pacific. Dr. Park, floor is for you, sir.
Thank you, Babu. Good morning, dear colleagues and friends. Actually, first of all, I would like to welcome you all to this forum and also congratulate you all for the successful day one. And when Babu asked me to do this, actually, I don't have to do this because we, UNEP, and along with other partners and colleagues, we provide platforms for you. And so we all come together and then discuss to identify the challenges and to find solutions and so on. So it is your forum. We are the initiator, but it's owned by the government partners and our sister UN agencies and also all other stakeholders. And so I don't have to be here, but Babu, since he's from Asia, in Asia, as we all know, you know how they treat their boss, and the elders are much older than he is, and so that's why he put me in this position. So I'm gladly like to share with you the summary of the first day. The first day of the Second Asia Pacific Adaptation Forum on Climate Change began by opening plenary and followed by 13 parallel sessions. Parallel sessions were organized under a broader theme, that is a policies, program and plans, and learning from practices. The session under policies and the program and plans were international arrangement, national policies, strategies and program, and the local government program, private sector strategies, responsibilities and contribution, and multi-level coordination, integrating adaptation and mitigation action, and building climate resilient cities. And sessions on the learning from practices were managing water, food and agriculture, and disaster management and climate change adaptation, community-based adaptation, and gender and adaptation mainstreaming, ecosystem-based adaptation, and mainstream and alternative media. Key points from the day, along with many other messages, were international climate change negotiations has made progress, but it is not enough. Pace needs to be expedited with more ambitious target on mitigation, without addressing needs for reduction of greenhouse gas emission. Addressing adaptation will be more challenging. Changing paradigm of adaptation through a reinforced long-term commitment towards adaptation, B, consolidation and defragmentation as a lesson from disjointed national actions in the past approaches. C, predictability as an approach to balance the funds between adaptation and mitigation are key outcome of the international negotiations to address long-term adaptation needs. And on the importance of programmatic approach on adaptation financing highlighted for mainstreaming adaptation into the national action plans, and no longer as a standalone project. Cross-sector integration requires interministerial systematic collaboration, coordination coming from the highest state level, not just mere dialogues and representatives. It needs a shared understanding among different ministries and the line agencies to produce more coherent vision and goal in tackling CCA, climate change adaptation. Climate change adaptation measures have to be coordinated among different agencies, stakeholders, and across political boundaries in order to succeed in building climate resilient cities. The need for coordination and collaboration shows that soft measures are as vital to hard measures in planning for climate resilient cities. There is a need for definite climate change data projection and information for clear guidance on long-term development plan. However, there is also a clear need to operate the capacity of local government actors to interpret and utilize this data effectively in their own local economic development plans and local adaptation plans. Developing countries in the region need support in the area of technologies, finance, capacity building, and knowledge. Durban has made progress on technology mechanism and the Green Economic Fund. Implementation of technology mechanism should consider existing initiatives such as this forum and network for implementation. It is important to look for local champions to promote new adaptation technologies and change behavior of people. Climate resilient development should be ultimate goal, which include social dimension, integrated transformation approach, and adaptation finance to support transformative changes. Climate-proofing development strategies is essential for the success of climate change adaptation. Urban resilience strategies should encompass a wider scope of consideration, moving beyond physical boundaries to include surrounding rural, peri-urban, and watershed areas. For such strategies to work, there has to be a recognition of ecological interdependence. City land use planning should be integrated with rural planning. Urban-rural linkages that recognize the presence of peri-urban areas cannot be disregarded in building climate-resilient cities. In light of the changing global climate, all development programs must have climate change consideration in its design and the planning phase. There are knowledge and adaptation available, but is fragmented. There is a limited exchange between scientific research community and decision makers. Researchers have limited knowledge on how current decision making is happening and need to understand it better. A gap in knowledge and the planning in regard to climate change adaptation exists in local government programs and practices. Knowledge gaps, monitoring of knowledge, and sufficient dissemination of knowledge is the key issue in mitigation and adaptation linkages. DRL and the CCA financing should look beyond public expenditure. Market expenditures in the form of risk financing should be explored. We should help private organizations to realize and start considering risks posed by CCA to protect their own investments. Engagement of private sector and role of business schools in providing capacity building on climate change adaptation for new generations of business leaders is important, so that companies could see how they can engage in climate change adaptation. Community-based adaptation, which is strengthened by thick vertical and horizontal relationships within community, municipality, and neighboring municipalities, is a vital part of disaster management. There is a need to distinguish community-based adaptation from ecosystem-based adaptation. Their uniqueness should be further understood as well as replicated and replicable. Given the various ecosystems present, there is a need to reflect on thresholds at which ecosystem-based approaches can work, relating to the diminishing trends or services that ecosystem provides. Local media play a crucial role in spreading the message on climate change adaptation, which is very much localized. But they are not able to play this role since they are not part of the climate change disclosures. And once again, too many jargons thrown at them. Thus, explaining to public is a challenge, and addressing climate change adaptation at the local level cannot be achieved. So, communication has to be improved with public. Social media versus mainstream media. Although many felt that social media now is a powerful tool in reaching the mass globally, but few felt that the most vulnerable and the bigger mass in developing countries do not have access to. They still need old school broadcasting. And also Day One ends by film festival, journalist awards, and the reception. 3 films awarded and 7 journalist awards. Thank you very much. And before I close, I would like to make a housekeeping announcement. Those who already fill the evaluation form, I appreciate. And those who has not, please fill out the application form and bring it to the Secretariat so that next year, when we provide the forms, we can improve the contents of the form and all other elements of the form. So your inputs will be very much appreciated, and it is crucial to make this your forum, not our forum. As I said, we initiated, but the ownership belongs to you. It is your forum. So to make it better, your inputs are very important and very much appreciated. So those who hasn't filled out the evaluation form, please do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Park. I'd now like to turn us to our first session of the morning, the Governance of Adaptation session. My name is Tom Beloe. I'm a Governance and Aid Effectiveness Advisor with UNDP's Asia Pacific Regional Centre based here in Bangkok. And it's my great pleasure to be here with our panellists to help stimulate a lively discussion, we hope, amongst you as much as between you and ourselves. It's an exciting topic which I'm sure will get your days off to the right start that you were looking for. As I said, I'm a governance advisor. I've been working with a multidisciplinary team looking at the governance of climate change within UNDP for the last couple of years. And my experience suggests that there is one slide that I should put on record for this meeting. And I'd like please to put that slide on record now. That's not my slide. There we are. I feel that our discussion today is bridging a number of parallel dimensions. I think perhaps this is most characterized at the end of last year, when a number of officials, primarily from ministries of finance and heads of development agencies, met in Busan, Korea, for the 4th High-Level Forum on Development Effectiveness, to discuss the issues of the governance of ODA, to discuss issues of ownership, transparency and accountability, and results. Meanwhile, at exactly the same time, in a location a little far away from Busan in Durban, officials from ministries of environment and climate-related institutions also met to discuss issues around the governance of climate change, including governance of climate change finance. I feel that the discussion that we're trying to stimulate today tries to bridge those two communities to address the issue of the governance of development and the governance of adaptation within development. Let me suggest three themes before passing over to our first panellist, which might help us guide discussion. The first is ownership. Who owns the adaptation agenda? If one looks at the media, one sees a flurry of activity in the international community. The UNFCCC, as already mentioned. We also see rising flows of ODA related to climate, 22 billion in 2011. That constitutes 16% of all ODA in the world and has risen significantly over the last few years. And yet, if one looks a little more closely at national agendas, and if one looks at the budgets of governments in all the developing countries of the world, one sees that it isn't only international finance that is being used to respond to climate change. In fact, recent work that UNDP has been conducting on budgets in the Asia-Pacific region shows that the majority of climate-related finance and adaptation expenditures are already coming from government budgets. In Bangladesh, $1 billion per annum is being spent on adaptation primarily. That's far more than all the ODA that is being provided to Bangladesh on climate. In Nepal, 6% of the national budget is already being spent on climate. These are huge figures, and it suggests the ownership of the agenda is already being embedded in national systems. And yet, that introduces perhaps the second theme, transparency and accountability. No government yet, to our knowledge, is tracking climate-related expenditures within their own systems. And yet again, work that we've conducted begins to highlight where most of those expenditures are taking place. Again, in Bangladesh, 22% of all climate-related expenditures are expended at the local level. 20% are expended through the Ministry of Agriculture. 18% through disaster risk reduction. And yet, there are no performance measurements for that money being allocated to climate. Issues there around who is accountable for the agenda for climate change. And brings us to perhaps the third theme that may help us guide discussion, which is participation and equity. If so much money is being spent at the local level on adaptation-related activities, how are the vulnerable being impacted upon? How are the targeting systems in place to ensure expenditures are targeted the most vulnerable? And how are vulnerable and excluded groups included in the policy-making and programming decisions that determine where adaptation expenditures are prioritised? So there are three themes perhaps that may help us in our discussion, and one overarching concern with bridging the parallel dimensions in this room. But now, may I please pass to our first panellists. We have agreed amongst ourselves to discuss each one in turn for 5 minutes. After the series of panellists, only 4, so we'll be brief. We'll then turn over to the audience and hope to hear your discussion amongst yourselves, as well as answer any questions that you might have for us. Our first speaker has come all the way from the Pacific. It's Brian Dawson, who is the Senior Climate Change Advisor at the Secretariat of the Pacific Community. And Brian, I'll pass over to you, please.
Thanks, Thomas. Good morning, everyone. I was so thrilled to actually see this issue on the table as a major agenda item, and particularly for a plenary session, because the issue of governance is rarely given the sort of profile that it probably deserves in the adaptation agenda. And from my point of view, I think that good governance is probably the cornerstone of that adaptation response, and I think we need to pay much more attention to it. I just want to be very But generally in the Pacific and elsewhere, the way we are managing our natural resource systems is quite poor at best, I think, is to state it bluntly. And I think much can be done to improve managing existing variability and the sort of pressures that are faced by population growth, which is a major issue in the Pacific Islands region, and the unsustainable resource practices that are in place in forestry, agriculture. And it's also an area where we're talking about ownership of decision-making on adaptation, where the community level decision-making process can actually come and be quite an important influence on how we adapt. So I think some of the work that we're doing in the region is looking at sustainable fisheries management of coastal reefs, looking at agricultural practices, and also highlighting the role of traditional means of coping with climate variability. And they're often subsumed in a sort of broader context of economic development that sort of characterises the whole development assistance aid programs that development partners help their countries with. So the point I want to make is firstly that until we can actually manage our systems effectively, the existing resource systems, managing the implications of climate change is going to be difficult. So we shouldn't underrate just doing better with what we're already doing at the moment. The second point I want to make is about managing risk and having appropriate information which underpins governance. And this is an extremely important point because a lot of people say, oh, we know about the science of climate change, we know what's going to happen, let's just get out there and adapt. And no disrespect to any of our development partners, but often they're driven by political imperatives to have a development project in place, to have something they can cut a ribbon on, and look, we've done adaptation, it's all very good, let's move on to the next task. Where in reality there's lots of things we don't know. We've got a rough idea of where we're going with climate change, but in terms of the detail on the ground of what's going to be faced by what communities and what the potential response options are, I think the information base is still quite poor. So a lot of donors and development partners don't like to invest in research and information, but I think that's one area we need to understand the risk profile. We need to spend more time and effort into really working out what climate change means for these communities, and in particular, what the time frames are. Climate change is a slow process. The commitment to it is not. It's quite rapid, but the actual process of climate change is slow. And some of the impacts, particularly in the Pacific, like sea level rise, are quite long-term, and we're talking multiple decades. We had time to put in place appropriate structures and understanding at the national level, at the international level, and more particularly at the provincial and community level where the adaptation occurs. Put in place the proper information systems, to put in place methods of actually understanding and managing risk, appropriate risk aversion activities. And I think that's an area that requires much more attention from the international community, is understanding what we're actually facing and what are the most appropriate response actions. The third and final point I would like to make regards climate change finance. And this has sort of captured the imagination of people and the international debate of all these big figures of $100 billion a year, etc., etc. The reality is that the way that climate change adaptation is approached on the ground in most developing countries is still very much a project-by-project approach. There's no way that we can effectively program that quantity of money using that approach and to hope to have some sustainable outcomes in the long term. Now, it's a two-edged sword. One is having finance available. The second component is how you effectively manage and govern that at a national level and at a sub-national level. And a lot of processes are in place that are very siloed in terms of the way budgets are run, and there's not a lot of cross-integration between ministries. Climate change requires a more holistic approach, but it also needs to have in place good governance mechanisms, judiciary mechanisms, and to adopt a more sector-wide budget support sort of approach and leave the
before this meeting with the panelists over at Meeting Room 1 and me myself sitting here rather lonely all by myself, so that's reassuring. Now it's great that we can ask Heather McGray, Senior Associate from the World Resources Institute, to give her remarks as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be able to speak on this topic here with you today, and I'm looking forward to questions and discussion. I did want to raise a quick flag of caution about the title of our panel, though. The phrase governance of adaptation, in some respects, could lead us in the wrong direction, as if adaptation were a distinct governance challenge. I would argue one of the core challenges in the governance of adaptation is actually to integrate adaptation into the governance of a whole range of other things. The governance of land, the governance of water, the governance of international assistance. And that this integration challenge is actually one of the core issues that faces us as we think about governance here. Now, climate change poses some challenges to governance. It poses some real difficulties in terms of how decisions are made. And I would suggest that governance itself, in many cases, may need to be adapted. How we make decisions, who makes decisions, where decisions are made, may need to shift as a result of climate change in some cases. In particular, two issues that climate change raises, which Brian and Tom have already touched on, pose these challenges to our traditional decision-making. The first is the long-term nature of many climatic changes that we face, and the challenge of current decision-making systems to really think long-term. Thinking 50 to 100 years out isn't something we necessarily do very naturally, I'm afraid. And then secondly, there are new types and new levels of uncertainty that we're looking at with our climate. Many of our decision-making systems sort of assume a certain stationarity to climate. Of course, there's natural variability, but the science is showing us that the changes we're potentially facing are potentially significant, and there's a lot of uncertainty about what they are and when we'll see them. And this is certainly a challenge for decision-making. The good news, though, is that some of the changes we'll need to make in decision-making to meet these challenges, I think actually are things that we have some experience with. They're not necessarily easy to implement in the development context. Sometimes they're particularly challenging. But we can put our finger on some aspects of good governance that are especially important for adapting to climate change, and where we can begin to explore the kinds of adaptations to governance itself that we need. I thought I would raise sort of three challenging areas of governance where I think we need some changes. But you'll see it's not rocket science. It's not things you've never heard of before. One of those is the evidence base for decision-making. There are a lot of decisions in this world that are made, frankly, not particularly based on evidence. There's a lot of political pressures. There's power dynamics at play. There's inequities that play into how decisions are made. Moving toward greater attention to evidence-based decision-making, I would argue, is one of the key areas where we need to shift our governance. This includes things like vulnerability and risk assessments as inputs to decisions. It includes monitoring and evaluation and review of effectiveness of adaptation and learning from that review. And as mentioned by Brian, the management of basic data and information systems is the very foundation of good decision-making in a changing climate. If we can't tell how the climate is changing, if we can't observe what's happening in our environment, we're going to be quite challenged to do that adaptation. The second issue, which is, I think, seen quite a bit of discussion so far at this conference, is the issue of coordination. I'm really glad to see this raised up as an important issue for adaptation. Working across sectors, working across levels of governance in new ways is something that's critical to tackle the adaptation challenge holistically. And this may mean inventing some new institutional structures. It may mean new incentives for people within decision-making structures to work together, to learn outside of their own silos. And also, there's some real skill to coordination. Even when there is an incentive and there's a mandate, it's not necessarily easy to do. And I've certainly observed instances where adaptation projects struggle as a result of this skill in coordination. The final area of governance I wanted to highlight has already been raised by Tom, and that's this issue of public engagement. There's lots of reasons why public engagement is important for decision making. In the context of adaptation, this connects to the question of uncertainty and to risk management. Without engaging the people who have a stake in a decision, how will we know what their tolerance is for risk and what kinds of priorities they bring to the question of risk as we look at the uncertain future of the climate? Now, that the basis for effective public engagement is well understood, but not always well implemented. There's a series of rights that are well enshrined in the Rio Declaration, in a number of international agreements around public engagement, and these rights deserve new attention in a changing climate. The question of transparency and access to information, both within governance and by citizens, is a fundamental component of engaging the public. Redress and remedy, essentially access to justice, is sometimes seen as somewhat separate, but in fact, if you're going to have public engagement, you're going to have disagreements, you're going to have conflicts. You need systems to address these. And these systems, I think, will be quite challenged in a changing climate, and we're already seeing many places in the world where they're beginning to adapt. There's, of course, a capacity-building agenda associated with public engagement. Both people within government and within civil society and at the community level need to understand climate change. They need to understand their rights. They need to understand their own governance systems. They need to understand the broader political economy picture and some of the opportunities and challenges they face. And this capacity-building agenda, I think, is one that many of us in this room have already been working on. There's also questions around the very structure of governance and how representation takes place and to what extent decision-making is decentralized. And these, as well, deserve additional consideration as we think about public engagement in adaptation decisions, as we think about who and where long-term thinking can take place, who and where needs to be engaged in thinking about risk tolerance, public risk tolerance, and some of the trade-offs that are quite challenging. So with that, there's actually quite a bit more that could be discussed on this governance issue. I have lots of thoughts, and I'm sure there's lots of questions. But let me leave it with those 3 points around critical issues for governance in a changing climate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather. Very provocative remarks, and very welcome to challenge the title of the session and make us think indeed that, in fact, adaptation is as much about transforming governance as it is about using our existing systems. So thanks for that, Heather. I'd now like to pass over to my left to my colleague David Jackson, who is the head of office in the UN Capital Development Fund here in Thailand. David.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. Indeed, Tom and I said goodbye to each other at the airport when he went to Busan and I went to Durban. So this is a reflection of this parallel universe. And it was quite interesting in Durban. Good that you weren't there, Tom, because it was really very scary. I think Durban was the beginning of the move from mitigation, carbon-related things to more focus on adaptation. This has been gradually coming, but I think it was sealed in Durban. And I attended a meeting which was very interesting about how chemical reactions speed up or slow down with changes in temperature. And the effects of this are only now really being thought about. So there's all sorts of things, both positive and negative, that could be coming our way. It was really interesting to see. And the other angle, of course, is that the 1 degree average, or 2 degrees average, but on a microclimate level, things got to get colder by 5 degrees or multiplied by that. second point, really, which is that we as human beings have always adapted to climate, and we've always reduced risk. And I think in this new industry, as a friend of mine, President Bickley, calls it, of climate change, we forget that we've always adapted to climate and we've always reduced risk. And if one looks around one in the different places, the way how homes are designed, the way farming systems are designed, the way roads are designed, it's always been there. And so I think this is where one has to then be careful about, climate adaptation, climate change adaptation, and what is already normal human activity. I remember in Mozambique during the floods about a decade ago. I mean, the Mozambique government made a great fuss about this, but in fact that place floods about every 5 years, and people there are quite used to it flooding, which is a little bit more than usual that particular year. And that brings me to my third point, really, which is about who is normally responsible for adapting to climate, not climate change, but adapting to climate. And it's normally local governments, local city managers, rural provinces and districts, who build the dikes, the flood prevention walls, the paddy field patterns, the irrigation, the housing standards, the land use planning standards, the zoning standards, the sea defences, all of these things that we do to make our environment livable. It's in many cases local authorities from various hues that are responsible for doing these things. Not as climate change adaptation, but just as doing their job. But who is responsible for regulating? It's often the central agencies that will regulate this, that, or the other in terms of land use planning, etc. Now, there have been a number of interesting conferences, and it's a kind of third dimension to Tom's two dimensions there. There's a third dimension, which is the local government world. So professionals have come from that world. And they have interesting conferences full of engineers and local government planners and things like this. Again, talking about adaptation to climate, which they always do, but recognizing that climate is now changing. And so they have to shift some of their adaptation patterns. And a lot of the answers to some of the questions that are raised, some of them may emerge from those discussions. I remember a couple of years ago at a different conference in Durban, nothing to do with climate change, but a local government conference. They were talking about abandoning a part of land which was adjacent to the sea. Now, the Durban Municipal Authority has a kind of public duty to look after land. And they said, we're going to abandon this land. And we're going to sort of retrace and put the seawall somewhere else. Now that would then affect insurance agreements, it would certainly affect property prices. And in essence, they calculated it would kind of pay for itself, because land values would change. Some people would lose out dramatically, some people would gain, and this would be a way of handling this without seeking extra resources from central government. And they found that when they actually discussed this issue with those people living in that area, they were quite relieved, because they thought something was up, but they would rather let's have it out in the open, let's recognise that this is going to happen, let's try and manage it, and we will slowly abandon this area and move somewhere else. And they sort of managed to sort out the finances. Now, sorting out the finances, I think is very important, because as these local governments realise, they're not going to get additional money from central government to do all of these things, particularly with the fiscal squeezes going on right now, but even without those. So my final point really is how can local governments raise the resources that they need to continue to adapt to climate, which they already do, but in a more expensive way, because the climate is now changing. And one of the issues is that a lot of the money ends up with the regulatory bodies like the Ministry of Environment, not the implementing bodies like local governments and others. And there's a number of ways in which this can happen. I mean, one is the whole issue of land use planning and insurance, and there's been some interesting debates around how to work on those areas. Another one is, of course, loans and bonds. And the big governments, Mexico City, Vancouver, who are sort of pushing the ICLI movement, are looking to try to get non-sovereign loans from the World Bank or other international financial agencies. And this is an interesting debate. Can a city borrow from one of those type of bodies?
amongst us here on the panel. It's lucky we're not talking about mitigation. But thank you very much for those remarks, David, which take us to where it's happening at the local level, which is so important. Now we have the opportunity to listen to Sean Batten, who is the Director of the Climate Change Policy and Adaptation Department or branch within AusAID. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. Good morning. I'm very happy to be part of the panel and to bring a perspective this morning of a country donor to these issues. I don't want to dwell too long on Australia specifically, but I hope that a quick summary of what we're doing will give some context to my further remarks on governance. Australia is committed, as many bilateral donors are, doing their fair share to assist the international community in respond to climate change. In aid of that, we're providing a total of $599 million in climate change financing over the 3-year fast start period. We've got a balanced package with 52% of that funding going to adaptation. And our focus on vulnerability will see around a third of this funding going to SIDS and a quarter going to LDCs. Australia's geographic focus in climate change, as it is in aid more broadly, is on our neighbours in Asia and the Pacific. But given the focus on SIDS and LDCs, we also have programs in Africa and the Caribbean. We've allocated about 90% of this funding, and we've dispersed a third in the first year. We're a contributor to the PPCR, the LDCF and the AF discussed here, and have recently played a key role as the co-vice chair on the Transitional Committee for the Green Climate Fund. That's a subset, or that's a summary, if you like, of what we're doing. The overall theme of the conference is about mainstreaming. I want to relate an early experience in Australia's climate change adaptation program that was key to issues with both governments and to mainstreaming. In 1988, Australia began to develop with each of the 14 Pacific Island Forum countries with whom we have very strong development relationships, Pacific Partnerships for Development. This was about increasing development effectiveness, Morris and Durban. These partnerships agreed to focus Australia's development assistance on 3, 4 or 5 key sectors in each country. Of the 14 partnerships, only one, Samoa, identified climate change as a priority sector. This was exactly the same time as Australia was announcing its first tranche of climate change adaptation funding and forced us from the very beginning to see that mainstreaming was the only way that this could work. From the start, we had to think about how to integrate climate change adaptation into the priority sectors the governments had identified, in sectors that won't surprise you, like transport, like water resource management, like energy and like food security. We've been through this cycle again recently in Australia with the announcement of the new government's aid policy, which explicitly aims to do fewer things and do better, at the same time as we are trying to broaden the geographic scope of our climate change adaptation funding. So again, there's no scope for standalone climate change adaptation as we work to expand our work in Southeast Asia and South Asia and Africa. The great value in integration is that rather than striving to build a new sector, new structures and new capacity, we're building on existing and prioritised sectors with national government focus, with existing structures, capacity and relationships. Adding standalone climate change activities eats up the capacity of our partners and our own posts in productive ways. The other great benefit that we found is that if we build capacity in this way, it's much less likely to be orphaned. Of course, our first efforts have been far from perfect, but this is the way we expect that more of our and others' climate change adaptation funding in the future will be managed to deliver. Our goal is to increase the level of integration of each successive phase of adaptation, just as we do for gender, for disability and for environmental impact. The long-term objective is that all Australian funded activities and possibly all donor funded activities consider climate change during their development. Another key issue for the governments of adaptation is the management of external political imperatives. These political imperatives come to us from national governments, both developed and developing, from sceptical populations. Not all of the people out there share the views and the importance of what we're doing in here, and from the UNFCCC negotiations. In summary, they tend to demand combined departments, in central departments, and with future leaders. And through community-based adaptation work, a way in which we can work without burdening central governments. Finally, I'd like to pose a couple of questions and raise a few issues for our discussion. I think we need to be much better at explaining what climate change adaptation is. It's not tsunamis, it's not just DRR, it's certainly not just seawalls. We know this, but until we can get greater understanding for our adaptation work, adaptation will remain the core cousin of mitigation and risks being a forgotten child of development. We need to integrate CCA better ourselves. In the beginning, we had little choice but to do the science, the modelling, the assessment, the adaptation planning, and the concrete actions in parallel. Both Brian and Heather talked about this. Now, as our adaptation programs are becoming more mature, we have the capacity to design our programs based on the science that we've done, so that our own programs are stronger and give us better stories to tell. We need to work together, and I think nearly every presentation I've heard in the last day has talked about coordination. We do need to measure and report our successes. It's a long-term challenge, and it's very difficult to measure the bad things that don't happen. I don't think this means we have to measure everything, but we do need to look at what we can measure and what we can achieve to give us the ability to explain the importance of adaptation. And finally, we need to share our knowledge and our lessons. On that note, I'd like to thank APAC and look forward to seeing you all again next year.
Thanks very much, Sean, for asking that rather difficult question, which is what is it that we're talking about? So thank you for that, Sean. But your farewell is a little premature. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions for you now as we open for the floor. But as I said right at the beginning, please let's treat this as an open discussion within this room, not just as a dialogue between the panel and the audience. Please share your remarks, ask any questions if you do have them. We have about half an hour now within which to have this discussion. Please also introduce yourself when you ask your question or provide your remarks. Don't be shy, it'll be good to know who we're talking with. So, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Blake, and I'm definitely not shy, so thanks for that. I really appreciated all of the insightful remarks of the panelists. Several of you commented on the importance of mechanisms for improving governance in general. And I was wondering if you could comment, or anyone in the room actually could comment about the specific mechanisms that we're talking about. In the Mekong region where I work for WWF, we've talked a lot about improving regional coordination. And the countries in the Mekong region are actually committed to this. They actually work together through the Mekong River Commission and also through something called the Greater Mekong Subregion that ADB convenes, and ADB colleagues can talk more about that. So I was just wondering if anyone could talk about the kinds of specific mechanisms that actually would help improve coordination, the kinds of incentives that we could help government and other institutions think about or put into place to help with that coordination. Because, for example, we talked about having some kind of regional climate change agreement for the Mekong countries that the countries seem interested in. They know that they have to cooperate on this issue, but they don't want any new structures. And anytime you talk about a new institution, they always, their eyes glaze over, they shake their heads, they don't want to do it, they don't want an additional burden. So how do we structure this so that the countries don't see this coordination or the need to change the way that we're doing things as not being burdensome? And the last point I'd like to make is just to reinforce what Brian said about coming down to basics. Ecosystems are already providing a lot of natural resilience, and let's at least get that part right. If we can improve the way we're managing resources, I think that would really help a lot. And finally, adaptive management, and I come from the US. We've had adaptive management as a core value for most of our government agencies, and I just don't see it. So how do we actually get there? What incentives do we need to put into place to make that happen? Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much for not being shy and bringing those issues to the discussion. I'm looking now around the room to take a few more. Please, the front row.
Thank you very much. You want to China for Social Environment Institute, also extremely good intervention, I think, very, very interesting. I got a little bit of this sense sometimes that we are sort of separating between the mitigation and the adaptation agenda, and I think that in many cases they are actually quite well connected. The last presenter, for instance, made a separation on how much money you're spending in your ODA on adaptation versus mitigation. I'd like to have some comments on that. When we're talking about mainstreaming and integration, don't we need to also look at these two aspects more connected also? Bioenergy is a good case in point, and in particular when we talk about green economy, I think there are many links between adaptation and mitigation.
Great, a few more before we pass back to the panel, please.
Dennis Wills of Sea Change, Community of Practice on Monitoring and Evaluation of Climate Change Interventions. I heard a lot about the sound management of natural resources and resources, also the vast amount of money allocated to climate and the call for sector-wide budget approaches, and also evidence-based decision-making and good M&E. One thing that I hear from the members of my community of practice on monitoring and evaluation is that it's very hard to get any money for good monitoring and evaluation. The problem is that it's still seen as some kind of overhead cost within the bigger budget, and no one wants to pay for it. So in the end, the question is, what evidence do we get if that is how we treat evidence-based decision-making?
Thank you. Just one more. There are lots of hands coming up now. Just over the far right there, please.
I come from India, and we have a federal state structure, and it was oftentimes you see sectors which proceed to adaptation or agriculture and water, and this is being a state subject, oftentimes it gets into conflict. So one of the reasons that National Action Plan is not really taken off in a big way of the Indian government is because of this kind of a difference. So, what kind of new structure one would really advocate in these circumstances?
I'm going to pause there just to see if any of our panelists would like to respond to any of those issues and questions. Those are questions, let me reiterate, not just for the panelists, because they're difficult ones. I don't want our panelists to have to address all of them. So anyone in the audience who would like to address any of those questions, please also make sure that you signal your request to do so. But Sean, starting with you.
I'd like to respond to the question about division, as perhaps the artificial division between adaptation and mitigation. And I guess we've talked a lot about governance here this morning, and a lot of those are the governance, if you like, of projects and work. But the other element of governance that I guess we will have to be aware of is the international architecture, the UNCDF. And we, of course, began with an adaptation mitigation
of our adaptation will depend. It's not a very sexy thing to fund. It is not easy to sustain, but it is really critical. This is monitoring both of adaptation actions and their effectiveness, and there's a need to monitor these over the long term because in many cases we won't see the benefits over the time frame of the project. And also monitoring of the environment and the climate. Having a good pulse on changes in stream flow, in water availability. This basic information about the basic systems we all depend upon is actually not often sufficiently sustained and invested in. And finding new ways to find sources to sustain these systems and to keep them up and running is actually really a critical part of the adaptation agenda.
Great, thanks. Brian?
Yeah, thanks. I'll be very brief. I just wanted to make a couple of points about, one is how to improve mechanisms, particularly in coordination. And this is a big issue in the Pacific because we have a lot of small island countries that have got limited capacity, and they often spend more time meeting consultants and other missions from development partners than actually doing their job. So what we're trying to do in the region is have a bit more coordinated approach amongst the regional agencies as well as the development programs. And we're presently working with the Solomon Islands government, and Rex is in the room today, and I highly suggest you talk to him about this. But we're using one coordination mechanism and focusing on multiple engagements in one provincial area rather than separate project by projects. And I think that's got a lot of potential in easing the burden of sort of coordinating different responses. But the adaptation mitigation question I think is very important as well. And I think particularly in relation to natural resource management. And a lot of the good natural resource management is in itself a mitigation measure. It's not recognised for that, but it actually is. And I think that's something we should give more attention to, is that good land management actually reduces carbon loss to the system. And just quickly to support Heather, in the Pacific in particular, you go to an office, there's hundreds of documents about past projects that go unread, and I don't think we spend the time critically evaluating what the results are. It's all about, let's move on to the next project. So I totally endorse what Heather said.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to sort of link, if you like, the mitigation adaptation question with the MandE question. I mean, I think that you're quite right with responding. In a sense, we shot ourselves in the foot by putting the emphasis on carbon emissions, etc., and then boxing off, if you like, mitigation and tying it with the carbon markets. But if you think one way around this, out of this, is through MandE to get international standards of what is a valid adaptation measure, and to broaden, if you like, the validity from emissions to this broader adaptation stroke mitigation. What is a valid response? And I think there's various ways in which that can be done. And one way that is being piloted in a couple of places is trying to look at how, through the audit and the public expenditure system, you can actually capture some of these expenditures at a local or central level. And by sort of flagging through the public account system appropriate expenditures, you begin to pull the two together. It's not necessarily mitigation or adaptation, it could be both, it could be a budget code or climate related. Now, of course, then you get to the point, what is the climate related increment on top of the normal? But I think that's the area that we need to start to look into, so that you can begin to finance actions that are kind of mainstream, that are identified and very valid at the same time. And in a sense, that answers the question of what you do in a federal state like India, where the central government has signed off on an APA, but the government has not. But if you actually have, some way of tracking this kind of expenditure, tracking this kind of action, then through, the intergovernmental fiscal transfers and things, you can actually incentivize the local governments to spend in that direction.
Great, thank you very much, Scott. And let's now back to the floor. Front row, please.
Hi there, my name is Dawson from Climate Planning Australia. In regards to monitoring and evaluation, one of the things that I'm concerned about is that we often neglect to do, because it's probably a bit sensitive for the funders, is to monitor and evaluate the negative impacts of adaptation. So we have maladaptation. So a good example of that is, you pour a lot of money into a Pacific island to protect an atoll from sea level rise, but then you destroy the local access to fisheries, or you destroy the fisheries themselves. And that is something that I'd like to sort of see explored more as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Front row right.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Senna and I work for WHO in its regional office in New Delhi. Well, my question may be a little naive, but Tom, I'll not be shy. My question is to David. I could have gone to Google, but then since he's around, it'll be easier to put up the question to him. You said somewhat about raising the CDF fund, probably bond and all that, but then what are the areas that the fund is spent on, and what are the processes, or what are the recipients, probable recipients of the fund, and how does it differ from venture fund? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just second row there, please.
Sure. My name is Gurmeet Singh from an NGO in Malaysia. I just wanted to comment on this whole debate about climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. I think that's to be seen within the development context. And very often, governments in the developing country do not plan specifically for mitigation and adaptation, but they plan for development. And some of the development programs that they implement actually can fit into adaptation, some into mitigation. Although, of course, they try not to do too much of the mitigation because of this UNFCCC common but differentiated responsibility issues. But after development, of course, many of them are beginning to address mitigation. But I wanted to comment very quickly on this issue of silo mentality. I think this is across the board in almost all development activities in Malaysia as well as many other countries. But I think people talk a lot about transparency, but transparency depends on the amount of democratic space that is existing in the country. If the democratic space is limited, press freedom is limited, then transparency becomes an academic issue. There's not really any transparency. And even NGOs that advocate that they are agents of transparency themselves may not be transparent either. So I think we should look at transparency in the real context of the real world and not get carried away and say everything is going to be transparent. I think things are not transparent even in the UN system. So I think that's full transparency is the correct perspective, not to carry moved by it, and find out, will the truth reach the people, and will the people be able to respond to the truth? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Second row, far left, gentlemen. Front row left.
Thank you, Gareth from Future Ready in Sydney. I'm just thinking about MandE, but also design-related issues. Climate variability, forecasting, grid analysis, climate science generally is getting a lot better at short-term prediction. A lot of the policy, big grand policy statements stretch over many decades. If we look at political risk and political policy risk in particular, climate variability modelling allows us to match appropriate programs to local needs within temporal frames that suit the existing political system. So if you look at Australia in particular, without making a grand sweeping comment, the political system in Australia, if the current government changes, suggests that a lot of those programs may have some degree of risk. Climate variability, I'm focusing on a 0 to 5 year framework, allows to address the most vulnerable programs and plan those programs to be delivered in that shorter, tighter time frame. Those then can be tied to longer term climate adaptation needs. So I think it's a design issue that should feed back from MandE and applying science and adaptability to what we actually do, rather than just being stuck in an older model. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the whole panel, all the new friends speaking, and your intelligent convergence. I just wanted to make a couple of observations. My name is Bonnie Biagini. I'm the manager of the Least Developed Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund, that despite not having the name adaptation in the title, are actually adaptation funds under the convention, under the climate convention. And I work at the Global Environment Facility. One observation I wanted to make was on the debate about combining the linking or linking mitigation and adaptation. I think that from a development point of view, financing and development point of view, there are many cases in which the two are separate, and I don't think there is anything wrong about that. Meaning, if you look at the global environmental issue from a scientific point of view, of course they're linked. So I see the mitigation and adaptation things combined more as an intellectual top-down approach. But if you look at the development perspective, there are many adaptation actions that may or may not generate a global benefit and reduce emissions, and not for that should not be recognized. Actually, they are the largest, in our case, especially for the LDCs, for the most vulnerable and poorest countries in the world. The measures that have to be adopted to finance, for example, to make the agricultural sector more resilient, to deal with the local management of water resources, to deal with health issues that are related to climate change, are not necessarily strictly linked to mitigation, but that doesn't mean they're not as relevant. So I think that when appropriate, yes, the two can be combined, but if they're not, then it's still very important to consider, especially the development aspect of adaptation that is much stronger than that of mitigation. And then I would like also to share information with you with respect to monitoring and evaluation. Only because these funds were created in the early 2000s under the COP, we do have in the GEF and the LDCF and SCCF management of our portfolio, which is already a relatively mature portfolio, so you can already see what these investments in adaptation, if they are, how effective they are. There is a monitoring and evaluation system. There is a results-based monitoring framework, there are indicators, there are tracking tools, and there have been done already, carried out 3 evaluations of these projects. So since I know that MandE is very important, is, as Heather was saying, not very appealing to finance and to talk about, but extremely relevant because it shows how these financing, how these interventions, if these interventions are actually delivering their objectives and results or not. Just to let you know that there is a lot of work in progress, and you know, you can get a lot of information also on the indicators for adaptation, which are very difficult to grasp in this portfolio analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you. Namaste. I'm Dinesh Puja from Nepal, and I work for the National Science Academy. This is again one of the issues that Heather mentioned, the evidence-based decisions, which is a very important issue, I think. And evidence-based decisions means the scientific studies which are the basis for the decisions. But most often we find no support to carry out such scientific research and studies, despite a huge amount of fund is kept aside in the name of climate change. And especially when we are looking for the long-term monitoring of climate change impacts on various issues like vegetation, like the system, and even on the communities, we find very less or sometimes no fund to carry out some research. Is it a clear indication that climate change has become a political decision?
Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you. My name is Cheyani from Stockholm Environment Institute. I just would like to put some notice that I think the panel has expressed well in terms of the governance challenge at the, for example, national level, and also focused and highlighted that adaptation happening on the ground. But I think one thing is still missing in the discussion, how really what are the gaps in terms of the links between the governance at the national level and also the governance at the local level. So happening, a lot of things happening on the ground, a lot of projects really going on the ground, and we have very strong, many strong NGOs, also CSOs working on the ground, but it still is not really sustained in a way. So I would like to ask the panel, Well, is there any role you see for kind of think tank or kind of champion or some person who influence any decision making, but not decision making maker themselves, could play an important role? So if the panel can address these things, so it would be grateful.
Thank you very much.
Yes, my name is Ulrika Olsson. I'm with the Swedish Embassy in Bangkok. I think we're having a very, very interesting discussion, and also it was a really nice editorial presentation. I would like to raise the issue of measuring results. It was something Sean mentioned in his presentation. I think we're all under pressure to work more and more on results-based management, both from a donor perspective, but also from a partner perspective. I think, at least from the Swedish point of view, there is also a big discussion with the risks of RBM in terms of possibly moving into supporting a certain type of projects and programs. Maybe not the most needed ones, but maybe the ones that show more quick results. And I think this is something for us all to think about and to develop further. I would also like to stress the need for these types of events and the knowledge sharing that's happening these 2 days, and that we all need to put maybe more thinking into how we measure results of these type of activities. Because going in the line of showing more of results reporting, it might be that we end up with maybe these type of knowledge sharing events and activities not happening in the future, and that would be a pity, I think. So it's more a comment than a question, maybe. And then I think from also to chip in on the MandE discussion, just to say that I think from at least Sweden's point of view, we're very open to put more of funds and thinking into that, and are already doing so through various initiatives.
Great. Thank you very much for such a lot of interest in providing perspectives and some excellent remarks so far. I'm afraid we only have time for one more remark, the gentleman at the end there, before returning to the panel.
Yes, my name is Stuart Scott, and I direct something called the Interfaith Declaration on Climate Change, concerned with both adaptation and mitigation. And I will end up with a question for Heather, since she likely likes to stir the pot with challenging assumptions, I think. It was touched on by several members of the panel, the internal contradiction between all the meetings we go to, and again, the footprint, the ecological footprint of this meeting is huge, and we fly around the world to such meetings all the time. So I wonder, well, I know we love, as individuals, we love to travel. We love our vacations, we love our expense accounts. It's hard to get that out of our system. The tourist industry is a major contributor to governmental budgets and a major problem environmentally. And with climate, we have these built-in contradictions. And I want to cite the oft-cited Einstein quote, "Can't fix the problem with the same mindset that created it." So my question is, instead of, as one of the gentlemen on the panel said, I'd love to see you all next year, is it possible that this kind of event, could be groundbreaking in changing the paradigm and be run in virtual space? Now, you might not be able to keep people's attention in virtual space, but you might get more attention in virtual space. I see quite a number of people doing email here and writing their blogs and whatever, although there is an unusually large focus as well, and I'm very gratified for that. But might not this organization do well to try to change the paradigm and run a virtual adaptation summit next year?
Great, thank you very much. You would certainly capture my attention in virtual space, so I think there's a real potential there. There's such a vigorous waving going on from the front row that this will be our last one.
Okay, thanks so much. My name is Eddie from Indonesia. I'm from University Universitas Gajah Mada, Indonesia. We think that the climate change adaptation mitigation in developing countries is a secondary issue or tertiary for developing countries, not the primary issue. We need something like in developing countries we build infrastructures, provide a staple food which is suitable for our needs first, before thinking about the climate change adaptation. It is something like, not too important issues. It is something like supporting issues in developing countries, which the society is something like have to struggle for life or something like that, especially for underdeveloped countries. And from the point of view of decision-making process, from the university, I think we have to gather the allocation of resources by doing something like gathering of the research collaboration between university and community and also from business sectors, as well as from international institutions like United Nations, have to have something like role modellings to explain to every country, whether it is a developing countries or developed countries, how to make a better decision for, especially for less developed countries, in order to anticipate what will be happen in the year 2030 or 2050, where the world is changing, where the world is not as comfortable as today. Then we have something like managerial skills in an international level. We see Mr. Gore, we see such a person which has much influence in the real life of the people, which can motivate the developed and developing countries people how to anticipate what will be happen if the impact of climate change will be there in the year 2020 or 30 or 50. Then I would like to know what's your opinion about how to gather the resource allocation from nation to nation, from the perspective of research to make a better decision in the future. Thank you very much, and I'm from Indonesia.
Great, thank you very much, everybody. Such an enthusiastic discussion that we have here. So enthusiastic that it has required me to ask our panelists to respond each one with just 1 minute. So hopefully we'll be able to provide you with succinct remarks. Sean, why don't you go first?
So first to this question about results-based management, that's something that AusAID is taking on right now. And I had several meetings with the manager of results-based management in AusAID, and after the third meeting he rang me up and said, I'm having nightmares about results-based management and climate change. And I said, oh good, you get it. So it's going to be very, very difficult, and I think there are real risks that if we tie ourselves to quantifiable goals, it'll be very, very difficult. And I think a little, that goes to the issue we're talking about adaptation versus mitigation. And frankly, we have an easier run on MandE and on quantifiable goals on adaptation than we do on mitigation, and long may that continue. Very quickly, the gentleman at the front asked about, I think, sort of managing our timeframes and using the information that we do have now to make short-term decisions. I think that's absolutely right, but at the same time, we need to be cognizant of the point that Brian made about, sure, we don't see that the rise is going to occur, it's going to occur a long time in the future, so we need to prioritise those actions to get that right. And maybe lastly then, the very first question about maladaptation. I think the issue is not that we're not telling the bad stories, the bigger issue is we haven't captured the stories at all, and of course the bad stories are just as important, perhaps more important.
Well, let me see if I can make 4 points with my 1 minute. The first is to say I would be happy to participate in harder to replicate virtually, and it's going to take quite a bit of creativity for us all to figure out how we do that. Second, with regard to this question of adaptation and mitigation linkages, I, like Bonnie, share some concerns about assuming that these two can be easily linked. It seems a little bit arbitrary to link them rather than linking adaptation with health or with transport. And the real agenda, as raised by several questions on this side, is to insert both into the development agenda and to have development as the overarching priority. The third issue that was highlighted by many of the remarks in the hallway is that in the hall here is that we have in front of us a very political issue. When I speak of evidence-based decision-making, it sounds perhaps very scientific and apolitical, but it is not. Evidence is not used a lot in decision-making for political reasons, and if we move toward evidence-based decision-making, it could be quite challenging to many powerful players. This is not the least raised in the monitoring and evaluation discussion, and if monitoring and evaluation reveals things that people are not happy to see, whether it's donors not getting the results they want, or governments being shown to have misused funds, or just plain bad decision making. This is information we badly need in order to adapt effectively, but it's very challenging information to our decision making processes. My final point is that many of these issues that have been raised, really the first step in solving some of them is getting ourselves beyond the short project time frame and thinking about longer term building of institutions, development of capacity, and development of systems for decision making. That, as Brian said, is a 10-year agenda, and it's not something we're going to solve in a project. Thanks.
I just want to say 2 points. Firstly, on the issue that was raised in front of you about adaptation, I don't think this has been given sufficient attention. We're making a lot of decisions in the face of very little information and uncertainty. And as a sort of primary driver, I think one of the key things we should focus on is no regrets actions. I mean, basically those things that build resilience, that make sense with or without climate change. I think there's too much of a rush to hang the climate change adaptation ban on something. But we need to put in, when we've got uncertainty, we need to be sure that what we're doing makes sense anyway. And just out of my observations over the last decade in the adaptation space, I think there's pretty much a case that a lot of the activities that are undertaken are actually creating maladaptation. I think we need to be very, very careful about that. The second thing was the issue about bringing these national to local level bridges. And I think this is very important. A lot of the sub-national level, the regional government levels have been overstepped. I think they've been ignored a lot in the discussion. There's been a lot of national level planning. There's been lots of engagement at the local level that's also actually been jumping over the national level and the regional level and going straight to the local communities without proper consultation. And I think much can be done to building the different tiers of governments and connecting them. And as I mentioned before, what we're looking at in the Solomon Islands is trying to experiment with this. So I think much more attention needs to be focused on building the local area and the regional areas government's capabilities.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try and divide my minute between 3 points and 20 seconds each, but I've always spent 5 seconds. About that. So let's get on with it. With regard to the bond issue, yes, I mean, a very interesting one. event virtually. I would actually rather not do that and pose the question a different way. I mean, we've always travelled, human beings have always migrated. We're not going to stop doing that. But it's more the question of how can one have a lower carbon travel? Will there ever be a hydrogen-powered airplane? Can we sort of go back to Star Trek and sort of teleport ourselves around? Because I think that's where the answer is going to be, rather than trying to get ourselves always on the sky. I don't see that as being the future, even though it's, it's a temporary solution. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you to our panelists and the audience. It has been an incredibly rich discussion. Perhaps just 4 points in summary. I think, like any good panel, we've thrown away the title for the session. So that's a good achievement. We've thrown it away in perhaps 2 dimensions. The first is we've said, well, we need to build on what we've already got in terms of the governance systems that exist in the sectors that are already being addressed in a country's development process. We need to be wary that different countries have different governance contexts. We can't have a universal discussion about governance of adaptation or climate change in any particular context. We've said look at existing budgets. We've said look at those sectors that are priorities. We've said no standalone projects, but look to the existing programs and policies. And we've said let's look at the community level, because there is where we're seeing the evidence of climate change and the response that's already being articulated. It may not be called a climate change response, but it is a response. The second, perhaps, headline message that I think we've heard is, okay, build on what we've got, but adapt what we've got. We are in the process of transforming our governance systems as much as we are in the process of adapting to climate change. In particular, we've heard the issue towards the end of our discussion around political economy. Let's not take a technocratic approach to this. There are people who are champions, but there are also many spoilers to the agenda of adaptation and climate change. We've been thrown the very difficult issues of long-term thinking, uncertainty, risk management. These dimensions of government bureaucracies and decision-making that are not very adequate, but will need to be as we address the issue of adaptation and climate change. But our most important message, I think, is change our mindsets. Change our mindsets away from short-term focus on results and value for money and towards longer-term processes of transformation. We've been told that we need to base our approach on what we know, but continue to learn. A lot of evidence, emphasis on evidence and research. And perhaps even we've been told, yes, let's continue this discussion and this dialogue. It's wonderful that we're all here and have this opportunity to exchange our experience, but maybe we can continue it in a number of different ways as we move forward. So thank you very much to everyone for this excellent session. It's now well earned